I was just thinking that this was going to be like this night where it was kind of laid back and there wasn't going to be very many that would come, and you guys all are freaking me out. So, a lot of people here. What I want to do is share a little bit about my story and how I came to believe in Jesus. And I want to share with you that this subject, I'm studying to this day on this subject. I read about everything I can get my hands on, and there's some reasons for that. First, I'll share a little bit about this in a few minutes, but my story was a story of, I would say I was brought up a skeptic. I don't know if I was brought up to be a skeptic, but I am skeptical by nature. Anybody else in here like that? One of the questions I remember in my mind from the time I was little is, how do you know that? How do you know that really happened? And unfortunately, growing up, the answers were often, well, I just have faith. Now, I know you have to have faith, because there's things going on that you don't see with your eyes and those kinds of things. But what it felt like to me was people were saying that you just have to check your brains in at the door. You just have to, faith is to not really have any evidence, and it's kind of like wishful thinking. And that's not the Christianity that I've come to understand. And it's not the kind of Christianity that would change the whole world. Did change the whole world, still can change the whole world. And so what I want to do is say a couple of things to you. First of all, some of you, I think everybody deals with doubt. Everybody deals with struggle. Now, my wife and I are completely different. My wife has never, ever wondered whether there was a God or not. It hasn't even crossed her mind to do that. Where she gets worried about is, okay, does God really love me? So her faith struggle isn't about, is there a God? It's like she's dialed into that. It's, does God actually love me? Do I matter? I never had a problem in my entire life about would God really love me if he actually existed. If he exists, then of course he loves me. Every day of my life, my parents told me at least 5 times a day they loved me. The voice in my head is not, I'm terrible until you tell me otherwise. It's, I'm pretty good until you tell me otherwise. I'm fine. Part of that, everybody's got a voice in their head. Some of it is accusatory, some of it puffs you up with pride. My problem wasn't whether God loved me. My problem was whether there was a God at all. And if there was a God, which God? And how would I know that? And could I know that? From the time I was little, those are the kinds of questions that I've had. And I would venture to say that some of you in this room have those questions too. And where other people just seem to believe it, faith, accept that there's a God and Jesus is the Son of God and all that. The devil loves to hear you, kind of hear what other people are saying about that and get you to feel bad about yourself, because you actually have to do a little bit of wrestling. There's nothing wrong with you because you wonder sometimes. Doubt is a normal experience for a human. I remember when my dad was the one who kind of walked me through the process of becoming a Christian. I remember I came to him one day and said, Dad, I guess I can't be a Christian. I know I believe he's true, or I think he's true. I believe there's evidence for that. But from time to time, I got some really strong doubts, and I start wondering, is it true? Is it real? And my dad was a pastor, and I'll never forget what he said, and it just totally blew my mind. He goes, yeah, me too. Yeah, but you preach and you teach and you Yeah, I do all that because as I work through it and I look at the facts again and I think about all the things that God has done for me in my life, and as I think about the truth of all of this and what I know to be true, I have to fight against my doubts. See, I kind of believed that if you had doubts, it meant that you didn't really have faith. So the devil just stepped in and used that in me. Since I had doubts, I must not be a Christian. No, it's what you do with your doubts. And so I have to tell you that as a skeptic, there are things that happen that, as a pastor, I'll just tell you this. Things that happen, I don't understand when there's a rape, when there's molestation, when there's a murder, when something evil happens. I'm like, God, why? Where are you? What's going on? And I have to wrestle through. What do I know to be true? What do I know the scripture has told me? What do I know? And I have to work through that. And if you're like that, I just want you to know there's really nothing wrong with you other than what's wrong with you. And wrong with the rest of us too. Does that make sense to you? Don't let the devil whisper in your ear. He's an accuser. Right? And by the way, the thing that I've been blessed with is when I've had doubts, I've been able to walk in the light with them and go, okay, I'm really questioning. I don't know what to do with this with other believers. And sometimes, you can be told you're a pastor or you've been a Christian for years. You're not supposed to have, the devil loves you to internalize your doubt, not bring it into the light, because it's as you discuss with other believers who remind you, you're so in the forest you can't see the trees. They're not in the same forest at the same time, and they can go, yeah, but what about this? And the devil loves to isolate you with your doubts and your fears. Bring it into the light. And as you bring it into the light, you'll realize a couple things. You're not the only one. The devil always likes to tell you, you're the only one that feels like there must be something wrong with you. You're not the only one. And other times there are people in your life, Christians and brothers and sisters in your life, that can go, yeah, but remember this and remember that. And oh yeah. And it just works. That's why we're supposed to do this together. Can I get an amen on that? Especially when the whole world is challenging everything we believe. And there was a time where people kind of shared the same values in this country. And then we moved to, okay, we'll put up with your values, but we don't share your values. Now, people are absolutely hostile to our values. And as a nation, we're a Christian nation, supposedly. I don't know if that's ever really been true, but supposedly we share enough about all this, and it's going to be difficult now, because to be a Christ follower, it means that you're going to actually be challenged. The facts are going to be challenged, the values are going to be challenged. And we're going to need to go back to the truth over and over and over again if we're going to get through this. All right. Let's dive into this. There's so much more information than I could ever give. And when I've done whole series on this, and I want to encourage you. I read a lot, and there is a lot to be read. There are great historians, scientists, scholars who agree with what I'm going to say, and so much more. It's out there. There's not a question that you've come up with. That's another thing I figured out. I always thought, well, I'm the only one with this question. Where did Adam and Eve's sons' wives come from? I know I'm the only one who's ever had that question. No, every question you could ever come up with, somebody's thought of it. And bringing it up, just because you don't know it doesn't mean it's not out there. And so I'm hoping you're going to study. There's some great resources out there. Anything J. Warner Wallace does, Lee Strobel. You want to get really deep into issues, J.P. Moreland. We have a great friend that comes here quite often. Josh McDowell is actually in part responsible for me coming to know Christ. His son, Sean McDowell, is a professor at Biola, and he comes all the time. He's actually coming to our church camp to work with our kids this next summer. And so we have great resources of people, and I hope you'll look at those. Well, let me just get started. I have way more than I can actually get through, but I hope you'll you'll be able to follow. I have to tell you that when it came to this question of there's a God, I still remember in an experience I had at my very first class in college. I was in a classroom. I graduated from a little tiny high school. There were more people in that room than in my entire high school. It was sloped down with a floor, and the professor comes in, and he didn't take roll. It was my first experience. He didn't do anything I was used to, and he comes in with his briefcase. He opens up his briefcase. He says, I would like to ask you a question before we start this introduction to biology class. He said, how many of you believe, in this room right now, how many of you believe that God created the earth in 6 days and rested on the seventh? In a sense, what he was doing is he's asking how many of us believe in the biblical account. And remember, I was brought up Christian. I certainly, at that point, wasn't a Christian. If you'd asked me, I was Christian because I was brought up Christian, but I certainly didn't have any fruit in my life. I didn't like the church. I didn't like my parents. I liked to drink and do drugs a lot. But I still, because there was 20, 30 people raised their hand, and I'll never forget what he said. He said, I want you to know that you've been taught by uneducated people and you're in college to be educated. That was my experience in college. And it went on from there. That was just a brief introduction to what happened in my college journey. I got to the point where I actually believed that if there was no such thing as a scientist who was a theist, somebody who believed in God. I believed that because I'd been told that over and over again. I thought that was an oxymoron, a contradiction. I'll never forget when I shared that with my pastor father. And he said, that's crazy, that's not true. And he said, there's plenty of theists who are, Christians who are scientists. I said, that's not true. So he started sending me articles from different people that believed in God, that were scientists. And he started making me aware that I had a very narrow focus on what was true. And as I started to look through these things, I started to see arguments that really challenged what I was being taught in college. And as I started to look at things, I started to notice, even back then, there were issues of design that I could see. There were things that the first and second laws of thermodynamics were being contradicted by evolution, by materialism, evolutionary theory. As I started to go, and most people don't understand this. I know there's some of you in here that would say you're a Christian and an evolutionist. I think that's absolutely possible. A theistic evolutionist says, I just believe God orchestrated evolution. That's how he created things. I don't share that view, but it's not a salvation issue. But you need to understand that evolution was not created as a means to explain how God did things. Evolution was created to explain away a need for God at all. To say that there was no spiritual help, random accidental processes, and that was in direct contradiction to what some of these other Christian scientists or theistic, even the many Muslim scientists, those kinds of people, they didn't have a problem between God and science. They actually believed that there was a God, and I didn't know that was possible because I was taught that it wasn't. But again, I started to look at design. I started to look at the first and second laws of thermodynamics. I started to look at the laws of logic. I started to look at sentience issues, consciousness, near-death experiences. I started to look at a variety of different kinds of scientific evidence. I remember looking at the eye and wondering how could natural random accidental processes come up with the eye, the brain, the computers, and this is before they came up with what they're doing now in neuroscience and microbiology, looking into a cell and seeing what's really in there. They're like computers on steroids. It was before all those times, but I noticed these issues were real. And so I moved from what I would call an atheist. I kind of went through the journey of becoming an agnostic, the word atheist, no God, agnostic, agnostic, no knowledge. I moved from being a staunch atheist to being a gnostic to being agnostic, and then finally going, okay, I think there is some reason to believe there's a God. And I wouldn't call him God, I called him the first cause, because I didn't like the name God. So I called him the first cause. And as time went on, I started, the Hubble telescope came out and showed us that they came out with this big announcement, the Big Bang Theory comes into play, that science has proved that something came from nothing. There was just this tiny little dot of matter that exploded, but then all that, most people don't understand. I mean, Christians took offense to that, but from a scientific perspective, that destroyed materialism, a closed system. A closed system is there is no God. We're in a closed system. There's no supernatural. There's just this, but if it's open system, that means there's spiritual things. There's a God. There's something else working. And the fact that they went from nothing to matter, from matter to life. This was something that it just rocked scientists all around the world. So while Christians are all upset about the Big Bang, anti-Big Bang, the Big Bang actually wiped out a whole segment of what was being taught in colleges. I remember reading this from a professor who was very famous at the time. He worked for NASA. It's Robert Jastrow. And he said this. He said, speaking of Hubble telescope in the Big Bang, he makes this quote. It's a very famous quote. For the scientist who has lived his life in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. It just blew people up. And again, I was along for the ride during those investigative years going, wow, okay, we got a problem. Okay, so then I moved from this understanding that there was no God to, okay, there is something going on. There's something besides the body, besides material matter. There has to have been something causing these. Back by the way, then there was Nobel Peace Prize winners talking about directed panspermia. And here's what this made no sense to me. Directed panspermia, by the way, Richard Dawkins actually says this, while he denies that there's a God, he actually believes this could be a possibility. He says directed panspermia was the belief that there's the probability of life happening from non-life, matter happening from non-matter is so small, it's infinitesimal. So here was his point. We are actually a galactic zoo. There are space aliens who have seeded life here, directed life, and so while he wouldn't believe in a God, he does believe in a space alien that actually made life on planet Earth. Now, I remember thinking, and this is the hero of evolution. It begged the question for me, it's like, okay, great, if it took an alien to create life on planet Earth, what did it take for alien to be created wherever they came from? Is this making sense to you? Okay, so as I started to understand that believing in God actually makes more sense, I then went to the question of which God? Which God? Now, there's some presuppositions I started with, okay? So let me just tell you some of the presuppositions I started with when I started looking at the evidence for which God. Number one, if there is a God who created the world, then the laws of nature are not all that there is. Is it making sense to you? If there are laws, there had to be a lawgiver. And we see such divine order, and we see things like if the moon were 1 degree further away or closer, the tides would wash over the entire planet. It's like this setup. There's so many factors and such complexity. It's beyond our capacity to understand it. And so I'm like, okay, if it took a God to do that, then that's not all there is. And if matter actually came into existence, then God, it's possible that there is something beyond matter. There is something spiritual. If near-death experiences are possible, that means that they're not clearly physical alone. There's a soul. There's something spiritual added into the mix that physical reality does not explain. Does that make sense to you? Okay. So a miracle became possible to me. You have to understand, from a scientific perspective, miracles are not possible. If they're materialists, there's nothing spiritual. That's what they call them, materialists. It's a closed system, nothing outside of it. Miracles are not possible, which is, by the way, a presupposition, and it's why they reject Christianity, because there are miracles. And they would say the fact that there are miracles at all disproves the religion. Is that making sense to you? So they start with a presupposition, no miracles. But if there is a God, miracles suddenly become possible. And they already happened. It's a miracle to go from nothing to matter. Natural, random, scientific laws do not produce matter from nothing. It's not possible. Do you understand what I'm saying? Taking matter, non-living matter, and creating life out of it takes a miracle. It does not happen on its own. So if miracles are possible, then I can't exclude a religion on the basis of miracles. So now that went to, okay, rather than saying miracles are not possible, it would be more right to say that miracles are actually probable. Probable. So that was a presupposition I started with. Secondly, if there is a God who created laws, natural laws, it does not surprise me if there are spiritual laws too. If the creation reveals something about the Creator and there are physical laws in place, then would you not agree that the same God who had such detail and design probably has some laws for the spiritual realm just as much as he does the physical realm? Does that make sense to you? So when somebody says to me, I believe in God, but I don't think he says something is right or wrong. I think he just kind of lets you do what you want. To me, that's illogical, because the God who created the world says if you get gravity wrong, it hurts. Does that make sense to you? So for them to go, I believe that he has such design and detail and law to how he made the world, but over here he just says willy-nilly and doesn't really care what you do, and there are no boundaries, there's nothing that happens as a result of all that. That was a presupposition that I had to go, because again, I didn't mind believing in God as long as he didn't interfere with my life at that point. But I had to work through that. So now I want to get to the historical presuppositions, the historical presuppositions. I had scientific presuppositions, meaning I come into it with some what I thought is very logical basis for how I was going to decide what was true and what was not. I had historical presuppositions. Now, my background is in history. That's my background. So understanding that in history there are rules for deciding what happened and what didn't happen was important. I understood that. So here was a presupposition I had. If there was a real God who created the world, and he actually created relational, sentient, conscious beings, then, and there were actually spiritual rules, there was a way it was supposed to work. If that's true, then when I looked at history, The same God who leaves evidence for us to find him in one way can leave evidence for us to find him in another way, in another science or compartment or department. So I went, okay, if there is a real God, then whichever religion, if there was one, by the way, if you're a deist, there doesn't have to be a religion. He could start the world, step back from it, and just let it go wherever it goes. Several of the founding fathers of the United States believe that. I didn't see that happening. If God created us as sentient beings with feelings and caring ability and relational ability, it didn't just seem to me that it made sense that if he is a relational God, he would actually want to have some sort of interaction. And so that interaction would be historical. In other words, there would be some evidence that would distinguish the way, if there was one, from the other ways. Are you following me? Did that make any sense whatsoever? Can you help me out? Did that make any sense? In other words, what I knew about religion is that everybody wants to go, hey, there's just one religion. We all believe this. No, that's not true. As you start to study religion, they are so different from one another. And I believed in the laws of logic. And the laws of logic, one of the laws of logic is the law of non-contradiction. The law of non-contradiction says that two absolutely opposite things cannot be both true at the same time in the same sense. That's the law of non-contradiction. So therefore, there was no way that two absolutely opposite things could both be true. That didn't fit into a logical world. Remember, I believed that the same God who created logic on planet Earth, math, it works in all around the world. It's the same math. The same God who created the language of math, of science, he was intelligent. You can see that from creation. And so I'm going, all right, he's not going to be okay. He's not going to say none of the religions matter. And whichever one does, there's going to be some evidence for it. So that's a presupposition I started with. So which one can I actually prove? Now, that led me on a journey. The first one I wanted to prove was Buddhism, which is kind of a contradiction because Buddhism is a I'm God and I just haven't realized it yet sort of a thing, which fit perfectly well with the way I wanted to live. But I started to study Buddhism not from whether I liked it or not, not from whether I agreed with it or not. I wanted to know if it was true, if there were facts that would set it apart from others that proved that it was true, that historically I could verify it. So as I started to study Buddhism and I started to understand the history of Buddhism, I started to understand that we have no written documents from Buddha, no written documents from anybody who lived at the time of Buddha. What we know about Buddha comes 500 years later from somebody who went into a trance and supposedly was told about the life of Buddha. Buddha, when it comes to proving him historically, there's no way to do it. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's what I would call a metaphysical belief system. You believe it because it kind of, you like it, or maybe you're taught it, but there's no way to actually discern whether or not there's any evidence for it. So I went, nope, that doesn't fit. I then decided on Mormonism. And the reason I liked Mormonism was, again, I had a bias against Christianity at that point, and it wasn't Christianity, and most Christians didn't like Mormonism, so if I was going to pick one, I liked one that most Christians didn't like. And, part of Christianity was true, if Mormonism is true, but only the part that Joseph Smith, came through and rectified. And so as I started to study Mormonism from a historical perspective, that took about an hour to go, nope. Now, I liked it also because it was one that was founded in America, and I'm an American. So it was the American religion, so nope. I then looked at Islam, and I looked at Islam because it was one of the largest in the world, but I didn't like Islam. But for me, that was a challenge because just because I didn't like something didn't mean it wasn't true. So rather than look at whether I liked it, I had to go to the evidence for it. And as you study Islam, you find very quickly that there are so many issues historically, so many problems with this. And we'll get to the real problems of this one when I get to the third point I'm going to make today. But Mormonism, Islam fell away. There was another presupposition that I started with. If there is a loving God that created this kind of beauty, this kind of bounty, this kind of the world, this place, the thing that just there's a beauty, and then there's the love, and really, if a God is responsible for all of that, then one of the things I thought is, if he was true, then the rules that he gave would actually lead to a better life for everybody. And if you're a Muslim woman, you don't think, if you look at the way women are treated in that country and what was happening, it was not consistent with what I thought a loving God would do to one half of the world. And so there were problems with that based on, okay, would a God who created these kind of rules, who's not only is, these rules mean something on planet Earth, but these rules actually, if you follow the rules, you can have and then there's spiritual rules. And as I'm plugging this all away, Islam went away. I then went to the Baha'i. I went to Jehovah's Witnesses. I went to Hinduism. By the way, we Americans love to glamorize places, religions, because we Americanize them. We create a form of a religion that is very unlike what it's lived out like in the places where it's in control, right? So we've got an American Muslim. So we go, that's not so bad. Look at the way these people live. No, you don't really know what Islam looks like till you go live in a country where it dominates. Same with Hinduism. Again, back to the point. If there's a loving God who created this beauty and all this design, then there would be a set of rules that actually you could live out, and it would lead to a promising existence. Hinduism went by the wayside. Zoroaster. Finally, I was challenged to study Christianity. And so now what I'm going to do is I could talk about all the different kinds of evidence that I found, but I'm going to look at Christianity from a historical perspective. And again, I was challenged to study this. My father was a pastor, and I was doing all this study of these other religious documents based on, by the way, Josh McDowell's book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict. He was a historian who tried to disprove Christianity and became a Christian. And so that's where I got the idea of looking at it historically, is Josh McDowell had the historical criteria, and he tested Christianity by it. I liked the idea of the criteria, but I didn't like Christianity, so I just used the criteria against all the others. Now, I was being called a coward because I wouldn't look at Christianity from a historical perspective, which caused me to get up and go, all right, if I prove that Christianity isn't true, you have to quit being a pastor. Fine. If it proves to be true, you have to be honest, and you have to become a Christian. Fine. So, that led to the major attacks that I was taught in college. And by the way, these attacks are still prevalent today, but there are more attacks today. There are different attacks today. And I don't have the time to go through all the attacks, but I hope what you'll hear is, from a historian's perspective, when you really look at the evidence, your skepticism, you got to do something with it. And so let me just give you the three attacks that I'm going to deal with today against Christianity from a historical perspective. Number one, the first attack I heard more times than I could tell you in college, in my history classes, and I've heard them on CNN, I've heard them on National Geographic, I've heard things said over and over and over again. Pretty soon, we live in a culture where we hear something and we just start spouting it off like it's true. We never tested it. We never looked at the other side. It's fake news. You know how many people are living with a set of fake news arguments? I hope you guys have kind of figured out that there's a whole bunch of people who thrive in fake news so they can manipulate your thinking. Yeah. Now, the problem is we can't agree on who that is. But we all know what's going on. but it's not me. First attack. The New Testament was not written by actual eyewitnesses. Now, the New Testament is the documents that tell us the story of who Jesus was, where he came from, the miracles that he did, the resurrection from the dead. This weekend we celebrate the resurrection from the dead, which is the ultimate in verification. I hope you come back this weekend to hear what the resurrection means. But this is where we get the evidence. So the first attack is, this wasn't actually written by any of the eyewitnesses, and then they will use the argument from the telephone game. You guys know the argument from the telephone game. It's if you whisper in somebody's ear in a room, and then they whisper and whisper, and then what you get down there isn't the same as what you get over here. The problem is that their version of the telephone game isn't actually how it ever went. But that's not actually what happened. And then you separate the first witnesses and you go, well, the telephone game didn't start all the way back to the first witnesses. It started generations later. So we don't even have any real eyewitnesses. But see, there's a problem with this argument. First response to that, and again, I've got so many notes here, you can go on the website and get it, but I'm only going to go through some of them. First problem with that argument is there were people who lived at the time of the New Testament writers, Jesus, the apostles. There are writers who lived at that time who declare they were not only there or around, they heard it from these guys themselves, and they tell us who wrote the New Testament. In other words, Papias writes this in he lived from 60 to 130. So he was actually an apostle or a disciple of one of the 12. And he actually writes this. The elder John used to say this also. Mark, having been the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately all that he mentioned, whether sayings or doings of Christ. Not, however, in order, for he was neither a hearer nor a companion of the Lord, but afterwards, as I said, he accompanied Peter. So he's saying that Peter used Mark, who, biblically, Mark wasn't one of the 12. Papias is saying Mark wrote it down for Peter, all of the accounts. So what you have is, your book of Mark, I don't know if you knew this, but the Matthew Mark was not actually written by one of the 12. It was written by Mark, one who was with the 12, and he actually wrote it for Peter. So while Peter was in jail, Mark went and took down his account. We know that, we'll come to this later, Peter actually was crucified by Nero, and so while he was in jail, Mark wrote this down for him. So your book was written by Mark, who wrote it down for Peter. That's what we've always known. That's what the first church taught. That's what Papias here says is absolutely true. And notice who he's getting his information from. John the Apostle. So John the Apostle told him, Papias, that Mark wrote it for Peter. And he didn't write it in chronological order. Anybody who reads Mark knows it's not in chronological order. This is a man who lived at the time. And by the way, you might go, well, Papias wasn't actually there, but how sure was Papias that this all happened? Well, Papias was martyred for his faith. So I want you to get a picture of this. He was so sure that this was actually handed down to him, or down to the church from Mark, from Peter, who was there, and it came from John, that Papias and many of the guys I'm about to read to you from died for their faith. What do you have to believe? What do you have to be for you to be willing to die for your faith? What must you believe? And it's one thing for you to die for your faith. To have your children, your wives, and your closest friends die for something makes it even more important to you that you're right on the subject. Would you agree? Okay, so Papias here tells us who wrote. Papias goes on in a later section to say this. He said that Matthew recorded the oracles in the Hebrew tongue. By the way, what are our earliest copies of Matthew? Hebrew tongue. So Papias says that Matthew wrote the book of Matthew. Matthew the apostle, one of the 12, wrote the book of Matthew. Polycarp, a disciple of John the apostle, he was burned at the stake at the age of 86 as a bishop, a disciple of John. He tells us about his devotion to the word and to the message of Christ that had been handed down accurately. Ignatius, killed for his faith. We have the early church fathers who lived at or near the time who tell us where it came from. Now, when somebody from Nat Geo gets up and tells me about a professor who says, well, we know it couldn't have been that, but the guys who lived at the time, who knew the guys themselves, who died for their faith, tell me that those guys actually wrote it, who am I supposed to believe from a historical perspective? The ones who lived 2,000 years after the event, or the ones who were there to know what actually happened and knew who wrote it? Which one? Okay, so briefly, I want you to get a picture of this. The names on your books are debated by scholars 2,000 years later, but they weren't debated by those who lived at the time that the church was started. At a time when, by being a Christian, it meant your death, you would want to be pretty sure. So, the first attack, I want you to get a picture of this. Irenaeus wrote this in the 2nd century. He said this: so firm is the ground upon which these gospels rest, that the heretics themselves bear witness to them, and starting from these, each of the ones of them endeavor to establish their own particular doctrine. So how many of you have ever heard the discussion of whether Thomas should have been in the New Testament, the Gospel of Thomas? There's a whole bunch of what's called the Gnostic Gospels. Irenaeus was so sure, the church was so sure of what books that were supposed to be in there, even the pagans were doing what's called pseudepigrapha. Pseudepigrapha, this is what that is. When somebody uses the name of one of the apostles to write a book in their name. See, the early churches you read through the New Testament warns us time and time again that false prophets and false teachers were coming in. The whole book of 1st and 2nd John, books of 1st and 2nd and 3rd John, written about false teachers, the Gnostics coming in and lying. See, it wasn't actually Thomas who wrote the book. The early church denied that it came from Thomas. Thomas didn't hand deliver it. They said, no, Thomas is a fake, and it wasn't written till 100 years after the life of Jesus. It's called pseudepigrapha, which is why it's not in your New Testament. Historically speaking, there's a lot of fake news. You know, I have to tell you this. One of the I don't want to say stupid, but do you guys remember, what was the name of that movie? Tom Hanks was in it, but it came from the book. What's that guy's book? Yeah, The Da Vinci Code. Do you know how many people I've been in arguments with? Discussions, where their main evidence is the Da Vinci Code. Second attack. First attack was, it wasn't written by the actual eyewitnesses. Second attack. The story has changed over time. The story has changed over time. The Christ myth is what they call it. In the early church, Jesus wasn't the Messiah, the Savior who rose from the dead. He was just a good teacher. He was a good teacher. But as time went on, his myth grew. His legend grew. And then they wrote it down. That's what they say. Now, the problem with that already is, if the whole first church in the first century knew exactly where it came from and who wrote it, there's a problem with that theory. But here's the answer to this attack that the story of Jesus grew over time. By the way, in Tacitus, a Roman governor, is actually a Roman historian, is actually talking here in the notes, and you can look those up, about how Nero killed Christians in the 60s, 30-some years after Christ. And he used he used Christians as a light post. He dipped them in tar and light them on fire. And he would kill them. So to be a Christian in the first century was a dangerous thing to be. And he talks about how they tried to stop the superstition that Jesus rose from the dead, but then they stopped it for a little while, but it broke out again. And so now Nero is killing Christians. But you start to see in the first century that to be a Christian meant that you lived at that time, and you'd better know what you were talking about and have a good reason to believe it. But here's what Pliny the Younger writes. He lived from 61 to 113. He's talking about Christians, and he's writing a letter. This is a letter written to Rome. They've been capturing Christians and killing them. And so he writes this to Rome. I want to read this to you. In the meantime, the method I have observed towards those who have been denounced to me as Christians is this. I interrogated them whether they were in fact Christians. If they confessed it, I repeated the question twice, adding the threat of capital punishment. If they persevered, I ordered them to be executed. For whatever the nature of their beliefs might be, I could at least feel no doubt that determined contumacy and inflexible obstinacy deserved chastisement. In other words, because they wouldn't bend, they deserved to die. They wouldn't give in to the Roman government. There were others also possessed with the same infatuation, but being citizens of Rome, I directed them to be taken to Rome for trial. I want you to understand that argument right there is exactly what the Bible says happened to Paul. Paul claimed Roman citizenship, and therefore he was sent to Rome. So this is absolutely proven. What the Bible says in the book of Acts is exactly the practice of the Roman government. These accusations spread, as usually the case, from the mere fact of the matter being investigated, and several forms of the mischief came to light. A placard was put up without any signature accusing a large number of persons by name. So if they figured out they could get your store or your property, they just accuse you to be Christians. So when you've been falsely accused, they came up with a way to deal with it. So listen to what it says. He says this. A placard was put up without any signature accusing a large number of persons by name. Those who denied they were or had ever been Christian and who repeated after me an invocation to the gods and offered formal worship with libation and frankincense before your statue. So remember, the Roman Caesar was God, and you had to worship him. I had ordered that to be brought into court. So he brings this statue into court, and to prove you weren't a Christian, you have to offer worship to it. And he says, he goes on, they were brought into court for that purpose, together with those of the gods, and who finally cursed Christ, none of which acts is said that those who are really Christians can be forced into performing. These I thought it proper to discharge. So he's writing, I let them go if they worshiped. Here, listen to their charges. They affirmed, however, that the whole of their guilt or their error was that they were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ as to a God, and bound themselves by a solemn oath not to perform any wicked deed, never to commit any fraud, theft of adultery, never to falsify their word, never to deny a trust when they should be called upon to make it good, after which it was their custom to separate and then to reassemble to partake of food, but food of an ordinary and innocent kind. By the way, listen to this. Even this practice, however, they abandoned after the publication of my edict. So when they were ordered not to come together in a large group, they obeyed the law. It's an interesting concept. But, not saying we should do that, just saying interesting, the way the early church worked. Notice what they did. They sang to Christ as to a what? So in the very beginning of the 2nd century, they're already saying that Christians believe Jesus is what? is God. Moving on. Flavius Josephus, one of the greatest Jewish historians, and any of you who've been to Israel, Masada, the story of the Masada is built around Flavius Josephus' account. He was a Jew who was captured, and he became a very famous Jewish historian. And he wrote many, many books for the Romans on the history of the Jews. And in his history, he's not a Christian. Here's the earliest, there's a debate about his earliest version of the account, because I think you'll understand the debate when you hear our earliest historical account of what he wrote. Listen to this. He's reading about the Jewish history. Listen to this. About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he was one who wrought surprising feats and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Messiah. When Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing among us, had condemned him to be crucified, those who had in the first place come to love him did not give up their affection for him. On the third day he appeared to them, restored to life, for the prophets of God had prophesied these and countless other marvelous things about him, and the tribe of the Christians so called after him, it has still to this day not disappeared. All right, so I want you to understand, this is a non-Christian who just said that Jesus did miracles, that he taught men and won over Greeks and Jews, that Pilate had him killed, that he rose again on the third day, and this is a first century writing. Did I just read that from the Bible or from history, from a non-Christian historian? Now, the reason they don't like this, they actually believe that there's no way that he would have written that. Somebody must have written that for him, or somebody must have changed it. But it's our earliest account. So what they did is they found some other later accounts, and so here's their later accounts. At this time there was a wise man who was called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous, and many people from among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned to be crucified and to die, and those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders. That's the account that every historian actually accepts. But still, what does it say? He was perhaps the Messiah because he did what? He rose from the dead. You see, I don't need the Bible to produce evidence for the existence of Jesus and for the story of Jesus from the first century. So here's what Justin Martyr actually says. His name Martyr is given to him because he was martyred. And we actually have his notes in the Roman archives of his court case. Justin was burned at the stake. And he quotes from Pilate's report. Pilate actually gave a report that we no longer have, but in the court case, he actually quotes Pilate's report on Jesus Christ. So at the time that this is going on, his court case is going on, they did have the documents. But now, as time and stuff goes on, we lose many to age. 2,000-year-old documents are very rare. So we have this document quoting his court case. Listen to what it says. It says, he quotes from Pilate's report, which was written at the time of the crucifixion, and he says this, it says, but they pierced my hands and feet, referred to the nails which were fixed in Jesus' hands and feet on the cross, and after he was crucified, his executioners cast lots for his garments and divided them among themselves, and that these things happened you may learn from the acts which are recorded under Pontius Pilate. So where else does it say that they cast lots for his garments and that they crucified Jesus? See, one of the things in history you try to do is you try to piecemeal who says what, and you try to put the story together. So we not only have Christians, but we have non-Christians who verify parts of the story. So in the New Testament, it says that Jesus was crucified and they cast lots for his garments. It says that in the New Testament. What does history prove? It verifies the story in the New Testament. Let's go a little bit further. Let's see if there's some other things. Here is Josephus 52 AD writing this. Listen to this. But to some of the Jews, the destruction of Herod's army seemed to be divine vengeance, and certainly a just vengeance for their treatment of John, surnamed the Baptist. So Josephus is telling us a story about John the Baptist. Herod, who does the Bible tell us it's killed John the Baptist? Herod. So Josephus is saying that there was divine vengeance, it appears, or some were saying that because Herod had killed John the Baptist. So then he goes on. For Herod had put him to death, though he was a good man, and had exhorted the Jews to lead righteous lives, to practice justice towards their fellows, and piety towards God, and so doing to join in baptism. In his view, it was a necessary preliminary. If baptism was to be acceptable to God, they must not employ it to gain pardon for whatever sins they committed, but as a consecration of the body, implying that the soul was already thoroughly cleansed by right behavior. When others too joined in the crowds about him because they were aroused to the highest degree of his sermons, Herod became alarmed. Eloquence that had so great an effect on mankind might lead to some form of sedition, for it looked as if they would be guided by John in everything they did. So I want you to understand, again, your New Testament writings are verified in history by secular historians. Let's go a little bit further. In the Talmuds written by the Pharisees actually, remember the Pharisees are the religious leaders who put Jesus to death with the help of the Romans. The Talmuds actually, they write about Jesus. Listen to what they say. On the eve of the Passover, they hanged Yeshua, and an announcer went out in front of him for 40 days saying he is going forth to be stoned because he has practiced what? Sorcery. And enticed and led astray Israel. Now I want you to get this. They're claiming that Jesus did sorcery. What is sorcery? Magic. They're not claiming that Jesus didn't do miracles. They're claiming that he did by the power of the devil. Is there anywhere in Scripture where Jesus was charged with casting out the demons by the power of the devil? They said, you're doing this by the power of the devil. And Jesus said, a house divided against itself cannot stand. Historically, the Jews give us their reason for putting Jesus to death. Let's go a little bit further. Justin Martyr, his quote furthers that he performed these miracles, you may be easily satisfied from the acts of Pontius Pilate. Thallus, I love this one. Thallus is a Samaritan-born historian, and he's one of the first Gentile writers to write about Jesus, and there's an argument going on about an eclipse. You remember that the Bible tells us on the night that Jesus, or the day Jesus was betrayed and killed, that there was an eclipse of the sun. Here's the argument. Thallus, in the third book of his histories, explains away this darkness as an eclipse of the sun. Here's Thallus, who lived at the time. Here is Africanus actually reporting or arguing with him, and he says, unreasonably so, because it seems, unreasonably of course, because a solar eclipse could not take place at the time of the full moon. And it was at the season of the Paschal full moon that Christ died. So I want you to get a picture of this. They're not saying that the eclipse that you see in Scripture didn't happen. They're actually historians arguing about why it happened. They claim it was a solar eclipse. The problem with a solar eclipse is that the time in which the Passover is celebrated, the sun and the moon are in different hemispheres. They are not in the same hemisphere. Therefore, there could not be a solar eclipse. They're trying to explain away something the Bible says that happened with what Africanus is saying is an unreasonable argument. The fact that they're arguing about why it got dark proves one central thing. What is it? It got dark. I could go on, but I want to, the clock's running way down. Let me just tell you some of the greatest scholars in the world. You only hear about the ones that they handpick. But here's William F. Albright. He says this. We can already say emphatically that there is no longer any solid basis for dating any book in the New Testament after circa AD 80. So that's within 43 years or 50 years of Jesus. 2 full generations before the date between 130 and 150 given by the more radical New Testament critics of today. By the way, why were they saying it had to be that long? Well, it's because for the myth, the Christ myth, to actually work, they don't have any evidence of a myth being created in less than 100 years. So they had to date the books later so that the Christ myth would have a time to be reasonable. William F. Albright from Yale said that's not true. 8 years later, after doing more research, he then said, after further study, I believe the entire New Testament was completed no later than 75 AD. Dr. John T. Owens, Cambridge University, he said, owing to scholarly sloth, the tyranny of unexamined assumptions, and almost willful blindness by previous scholars and authors, much of the past reasoning was untenable. In other words, it's not true. He concluded, the New Testament is the work of the apostles themselves or of contemporaries who worked with them, and that all of the New Testament books, including John, were written before AD 60. Sir Frederick Kenyon, Chief Librarian of the British Museum. The interval then between the dates of original composition and their earliest extant evidence becomes so small as to be in fact negligible. And the last foundation for any doubt that the scriptures have come down to us substantially as they were written has now been removed. Both the authenticity and the general integrity of the books of the New Testament may be regarded as finally established. The net result of the discovery, by far the most important since the discovery of the Sinaiticus, is in fact to reduce the gap between the earlier manuscripts and the original dates of the New Testament books so far as to become negligible in any discussion. There's other evidences. For instance, what most people don't know is that early Christians wrote letters to one another, and they would quote scripture. They would do what you do. Have you ever written, just remember, God works out all things for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose, Romans 8:28. How many of you have ever quoted scripture or read it or wrote something in a letter like that? This is Harold J. Greenlee from Harvard, Oxford University professor of Greek. Here's what he says. The quotations of the scripture in the works of the early Christian writers are so extensive that the New Testament could virtually be reconstructed from them without the use of the New Testament transcripts. Okay, so when you hear people say they weren't the original authors and the story changed over time, folks, that's just not true. And from a historical perspective, do you see why that rocked my boat? Because for me, I'd been told since the story's changed over time. It's not the same story. The early Christians didn't say Jesus was the Messiah. They didn't say he rose from the dead. That came out later. We don't have any early transcripts. We don't have any of those things. It was all untrue. So that's why I have a problem with fake news, by the way, folks. I have a problem with people leaving important facts out to get you to think in a specific way. Because it happened to me. All right, well, that leads to the last question. All right, so just because the story hasn't changed, and just because they were written by eyewitnesses doesn't make it true. It doesn't make it true. I love what J. Warner Wallace does. He was a detective, a cold case detective, who was an unbeliever, and one of his Christian cold case detective friends challenged him to use, he was lipping off to him one day, and to this Christian guy, and the Christian guy goes, hey, you're a cold case detective. Jesus' case was a cold case detective. I mean, a cold case thing. He was dead. We do that all the time. Go back and do the work and see if you think. Well, through all that, he became a Christ follower, and he's written several books now on being a cold case detective. And his main work is on witnesses, credibility. As a detective, when you have witnesses, when you weren't there, you look for witnesses. And when witnesses tell you their story, you have to ask yourself, how credible are they? It's the same in history. Police do the same thing. Historians do the same thing. How credible are these witnesses? So then what you have to do is you have to ask yourself a question. When somebody tells you a story, you have to ask this question: what do you get for your story? In fact, if you've watched crime shows and all that, if somebody got 15 years off of their sentence for being a witness in a case, the other lawyer, the opposing lawyer, always brings that up. So you actually got 15 years for being a witness. You got 15 years off. You're only going to be in jail for 3. You did participate in the murder, but since you're testifying against him, you only get 3 years. Why should we believe you? Do you understand the argument? The credibility of witnesses. You have to ask, what did they get? Now, when you look at history in general, and you look at religions, first of all, most people don't want to study the religion based on history. They like to study religions based on, did I feel good? Do I like what it teaches? Do I agree? Not whether it's true or not. When you look at religion, you have to ask yourself across the board, when one of these religions were formed, when Christianity was formed, how credible are the witnesses? Now, what most people would think about when you think about what did they get for their testimony, that you think about money, power, sex. Money, power, sex, the big 3. When you look at, for instance, Joseph Smith, the story of Joseph Smith is a man who actually started teaching polygamy. And he had 30-some wives when he died. In fact, he was killed in a gunfight because the jail was stormed by some of his own followers and some of the people in the town because he had secretly been sleeping with their wives and married them. They're his celestial wives, which he had sex with. And so when you think about Joseph Smith, you have to ask, okay, you claim that an angel came to you, he's got 3 different accounts. Jesus came, an angel came. When he came, he said, all the other prophets of the world are wrong, except you, Joseph, you will be my prophet. You have to ask yourself, who else saw it? No one. Then you have to go, well, did he get anything for it? Yes. Multiple wives. He became the prophet, even ran for the presidency of the United States. He was the prophet. They worked, they built, they did all this. He became very famous, very powerful in the church. And so you go, okay, did he gain anything? Yes. Power, sex, money. Joseph Smith. He died in a gunfight. Okay, so that would be Joseph Smith. When you start to look at the history, I'm not trying to be offensive. When you look at the history, that's what you look at. Muhammad. Muhammad said that God came to him and said much the same sort of language that Joseph Smith's angel or Jesus, depending on which account you listen to with Joseph, said much the same thing. All the other prophets are wrong, you're going to be my prophet. Who else saw it? Nobody. Well, what happened with Muhammad? Well, he created an army and went out and gave people 2 choices. Become Muslim or die. He had multiple wives. He became very powerful. In fact, he actually died when he was poisoned by a woman who he had killed the husband of to make her his wife. When you start to understand, and again, we're in the video age. This could be big trouble for me when I leave the country. But my point being, when you start to understand this, he became very powerful, very wealthy. When you go to Buddha, as I said, there is no historical accounts from Buddha. Nobody who lived at the time of Buddha. 500-year time span, all of a sudden somebody goes into a trance and says, Buddha, I'm real. Here's the story. Now you can tell it. No historical basis for whatever. But even if you listen to the story, he became very famous. He gave up his family, his home, and he became a monk. But he became very famous wherever he went. People honored him. So he became famous. Let's look at the New Testament. Let's look at the disciples of Jesus. What did they get? Well, what does the Bible say about sex? What do the guys who wrote the New Testament say about sex? How many times should a person be married? Once. And to how many women? One. And how does God feel about divorce? He hates it. So when you look at the New Testament, many of like Paul, he didn't have a wife, never married. Did they gain sex? No, they didn't get sex. They didn't preach that. By the way, if I was a pagan guy trying to get rich or to get powerful, I wouldn't have written some of those things. Right? Money. Jesus actually said, it's easier for a camel to pass through an eye of a needle than for a rich man to get into heaven. Jesus said, in the scripture says, if you love somebody but you won't help them with their physical needs, what good is your faith? When you see the Samaritan on the road, what do? Or excuse me, the rich man, and the Samaritan comes along, he uses the Samaritan as a hero to say he stopped and he cared for him, and everything that Jesus did, everything that the New Testament is about service. It's not about money. Jesus said, why do you store up treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal? Instead, store up treasure in heaven. And how do you store up treasure? You take care of the poor and you minister to those around you, 1 Timothy says. When it comes to power, Jesus said, he who would be first must be last and the servant of all. You don't lord it over people. Power is not a privilege to be abused. It's a responsibility to lay down your life for the people. When you look at the New Testament, what did these guys get? You hear Paul's life. He was beaten and stoned and whipped and put in prison. You look at all of them. In fact, what did the New Testament writers get? Let me just tell you what history tells us they got. James the Great, son of thunder, brother of John, was beheaded in 44 AD. Philip was scourged. That means he was whipped with a cat of nine tails. Then he was thrown into prison and he was crucified in AD 54. Matthew was run through with a sword in 60 AD for preaching in the street. James the Less, the brother of Jesus, was beaten with a club, then stoned. He still wasn't dead, a tough bugger, so then they beat him to death with a fuller's club. Matthias was stoned and then beheaded. Andrew, the brother of Peter, was crucified. Mark was tied to 4 different horses that were sent in 4 different directions with a sign on the horses that said, this is what happens to Christians. Peter was crucified upside down. Jude crucified. Bartholomew beaten then crucified. Thomas run through with a spear. Simon crucified in 74 AD. Barnabas hung. John banished to prison. What did the New Testament writers get? Now listen, it's true that somebody will die for something they believe happened. For instance, 9/11. You have a bunch of people that flew planes into the World Trade Center. Do I think they believed that Muhammad was the prophet, and by dying they would get 70 virgins? Absolutely, they believed it. But does that make it true? No, because see, they weren't there to actually see whether Muhammad did see somebody in the cave. They weren't there to see whether Muhammad actually did talk to the spiritual realm as he says he did. They weren't there to know what Muhammad was actually like. They're believing stories they were told that were concocted over time. See, the New Testament writers were there. They actually saw what happened. People don't die for something they know is a lie. If you know the story of Joseph Smith, you know at the beginning of the Book of Mormon, he's got his witnesses there. Did you know that every one of the witnesses he lists in the Book of Mormon recanted and actually started following different religions later on? Probably didn't know that. The Christians, the early Christians, every one of the writers was pursued, beaten, whipped, lost everything. And they were all given a choice. Back to the choice, you remember talking about what Tacitus tells us. Or, excuse me, Pliny the Younger. Pliny the Younger said, I brought them in front. I bring an altar here, and I just bend them down on their knees, and they have to worship. Every one of them were given those kinds of opportunities, but they believed it so much that they stood there, and they said, do with me what you will. But I've seen what I've seen. What would cause them to do that? Well, it might be this. They're walking down the road and there's a leper there who's covered in leprosy and parts of the body's fallen off. That's what leprosy does. And the man cries out and says, Jesus, if you were willing, you could heal me. And Jesus walked over. No one touched lepers. They were assigned to the leper camp. In fact, it was illegal for them, execution, if they ever touched anybody outside of where they were supposed to be. And Jesus walked over and he says, and he touched him. And where there wasn't a hand, there is one now. What would you do if you'd seen that? What would you do if Lazarus was dead 4 days and you were there and Jesus said, roll away the stone? And he said, Lazarus, come out. And he did. What if you were with him when there was a storm and Jesus, waking up, said, peace be still, and where there was a storm, there wasn't one? What would you do if you'd seen those things? And what would you do if he said, they're going to crucify me, but in 3 days I'm going to raise from the dead? And then he did. I want to close with this. When you look at the story, it's unlike any other religion in history. Again, I believe there's a God, and I think I have good reason to believe there's a God. If there is a God, then the story would have the kind of evidence that Jesus does. Now, I want to close and say, just because you believe this story is true doesn't make you a Christian. But you'll have to come back to Easter to find out what that does mean.